And good morning. It is time for the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. And now your host, Mike Hewitt. Good morning, Mike.
Hey, good morning, Brian. Good morning, Jim Riley and Matt Wiedenhoeft. Folks, listen, we've got what I hope to be a pretty packed show. We're waiting on a fellow named Howard Feldman, who's the Director of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs with the American Petroleum Institute. He is supposed to be calling us from Paris, where he is attending the COP21 climate change conference with the Obama and all of the rest of the folks from around the world that are there. So I'm hoping that he can make it in. Calling from Paris is not always as convenient as calling from the other side of the state, but I'm expecting him somewhere during the show. Along with that conversation, we're also going to be diving a little bit back into the Enigma report from last week, when we left off with, and I read from my Facebook page here, who can afford a college education in this brave new world? And there's some scary things. But before we get going, I got to pause to make fun of Jim Riley for a minute.
Oh, boy.
I'm on the way in this morning, and I'm listening to the morning show with you and John.
As well you should.
I was, and I should. Everybody should. I absolutely agree with that. And you folks were talking about transportation costs and going to Florida, and with the fuel economy being lower, air flights are actually a little bit lower. Is that what I got out of that?
Well, we didn't know for sure if that was translating, but just as a general rule of thumb, they seem to be quite reasonable out of Grand Rapids to various small airports in Florida. You bet.
So John hits on the word Uber for Uber cars. They've got a very developed Uber system in Florida, which I automatically translate to an anti-Second Amendment, anti-Constitution, gun-free zone, and I'd walk before I ever got in one of those rotten cars. That's how I feel about it. But I was making fun of you as I'm driving on the road because you're going, ooh, Uber. And then you segued from that to the new concealed carry thing, and that's what caused me to bring it up. It was such a wonderful segue. I wonder if Jim realizes what he just did.
Well, Jim didn't, but I'll take all the credit you'll give me, since it's a rare time that the credit flies around the palatial iHeartRadio studios.
Hey, when it's due, it's always due to you. That's
there
all
we
I
go.
can say.
Duty, and we're talking doo-doo here.
I get a kick out of it, though, because Uber tends to have conservatives and libertarians supporting it because it's this free market, anti-union stuff. And yet it doesn't want anybody to be able to defend itself. And that was a policy it enacted after one of its Uber drivers stopped a mass shooting in Chicago. And I went, why wouldn't they put this guy on the front page and give him a reward and say, thank you very much for saving a bunch of lives? And instead, they said, I can only conclude, they said, we don't like that policy, so let's roll back on it a little bit. I'd pay a taxi union wages gladly before I got in one of their cars.
Let me defend them, and I'll tell you why. Number one, I believe it is illegal for union taxi drivers or non-union in almost every city to carry handguns. And Uber's problem, as it is with so many small companies, and Mike, certainly you've experienced this, but Uber's problem in trying to enter into cities, or at least to stay in cities, is pure political. And we know that the cab companies give millions upon millions, their owners anyway, give millions of dollars to the politicians to keep competition out. So I suspect that this may not be Uber's intent, except in the world where they're competing, they've got to play a little bit of the PC game. I do know this. And I have been in many cities trying to get a cab. And what happens in cities when you're trying to get a cab, in particular at a time when you might want it, like when the weather is inclement, is that you cannot get a cab. And the reason you cannot get a cab is because the cab medallions that allow you to operate a cab in cities are very, very heavily regulated and restricted. In other words, they keep the availability down. Companies like Uber, or in your case, you've got a gun shop, you can imagine the dream of liberal Democrats, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama would just love to say, look, we believe in free, in the ability to buy guns, but we think the federal government ought to make sure that there's a limit to the number of gun shops so that we don't have too many. And therein lies the difference between an Uber and a cab company. But I think you'll find that it is city policy in every city, certainly the leftist cities where there is a shortage of cabs, that says you are not allowed as a cab driver to have a gun in the cab.
Listen, if it's a city policy, the city can do what it wants and vote, and votes matter. So if the folks in those cities want to trash their constitutional
Votes don't
right,
matter in cities, you know that.
well, listen, but that's exactly where I'm taking this conversation, by the way, because so many people are willing to say, you know what, I get it, I know why they don't honor our Constitution and allow us to defend ourselves, but it's a little bit like this. If you look on my Facebook page, on my personal Facebook page, I've got 5,000 friends. On the show's page, there's 500 and some friends. There's a lot of elected officials. Most of at least our side of the aisle in the state of Michigan are somewhere represented on my page, or their staffers or something. So when I put on here yesterday an announcement for today's show about global warming, and the fact that they've had two incidences. Well, one of them was 10,000 emails, and the next time they did a big hack job, they come up with a little over 5,000 emails from scientists that said they were trading recipes on how to make the weather models predict global warming, and they were looking for words. For instance, they said climate change is more marketable than is global warming, or congratulations for reviving global warming. Here's the problem. If our leadership and if citizens in general don't stand up to these things that are idiocies, when we stand around and go, what's going on with America right now? It's because nobody says it. Oh, that's not politically correct. We can't comment on that. We know global warming doesn't exist and that it's all about global regulation and taxation, but we don't want to say anything. That would be awkward. Folks, it's time to get awkward and step outside your comfort zone and take command of your world. And I don't care whether that's the global warming nonsense or Uber telling me I don't have a Second Amendment.
Okay. I agree with you. The only thing is that getting out of a non-gun Uber into a non-gun cab controlled by Democrat
I'm going to get into my
politicians
non-Uber tennis shoes and walk, especially if I'm in a town like Chicago or New York, by the way. Whenever I've been to any of those cities, I'm at a hotel downtown, I'm going to the theater, I'm going to a hockey game, I'm doing something that's within a couple of blocks, and Lord knows I need to get up and walk. And that's what I'm going to do before I ever call an Uber. That's just being honest with you. That's what I'm going to do.
I can tell you I'm torn with this Uber thing because I actually signed up to drive for Uber.
So you have a financial agenda, and that's what controls all the politicians that won't take a stand on this nonsense.
Hang on. I haven't done it because I signed up right before this whole gun thing. And then within days afterwards, this gun thing came out, and I thought, well, dang it, I can't drive for them now. Because I'm not going to go gunless in my car with people I don't know.
I got to tell you on that point.
And I haven't driven for them yet.
Listen, I got to tell you on that point, I don't carry very often. It isn't a question of can I ride without my gun. Folks, I don't carry a lot. Yes, I have a CPL. I own a gun shop. I don't have a gun right now. I rarely actually carry. It's the concept of a public arena where you're told in that public arena it's a gun-free zone. Now, worse than them telling me it's a gun-free zone, they're telling the bad guys it's a gun-free zone. And folks, we know how well that's worked out so far.
Well, look, I agree with you, and I don't like it. As a matter of fact, I just saw that Buffalo Wings. What's the?
B-Dubs, Buffalo Wild Wings.
Buffalo Wild Wings. They've got a policy right on the door of no guns.
I got an email from Red Robin about it. Email.
They have that right, but I have a right not to take my wallet in there.
And I agree with you. Yes.
And that's what I do. And it's not because I've ever been in there with my gun. It's because I have that right, and I'm going to maintain it. And I got to tell you, I watch America just shrug. Oh, it's a shame. And then they move on to the next catastrophe, and they say, oh, it's a shame. Folks, we've got to stand up at some point and say enough.
It's funny. I was just talking to my mom about this the other day. We used to own a roller skating rink. And if somebody would have walked in with a gun, we would have asked them to leave. And now I'm looking back going, why? We shouldn't have even thought of that as our policy because we were creating a gun-free zone. We didn't really own guns at the time, didn't know like all what we do now. And I'm thinking, man, that was kind of a dumb idea.
Listen, I'm not advocating for the wild, wild west. And there are some people riding on the road right now thinking, wow, that guy's a gun nut. Listen, I'm a collector. But it's like I said, I'm not trying to say let's make this the wild, wild west. But I am saying, how about if the good guys have the guns and the bad guys don't? Why is that such a hard recipe for people to understand? I don't get it. Honest, I don't get it.
Well, I think one of the reasons, and of course you know that I stand with both of you folks in support of gun rights, but one of the reasons that people do oppose gun rights is that they are hearing statistics that are lies from the people who they believe, wherever they get their media. Certainly, if you are
it's like a religion for them. They believe things that aren't true.
Exactly, and they believe little children are being killed by their little 4-year-old brothers and things of that sort. And we just know that is not.
There's 325 million people in America, depending on who's telling that story. A lot of people, and so yes, the media and the extreme uber left can find examples. There's no question. I can find examples of butter knives hurting people. It gets to the point of being insultingly stupid.
Well, the best argument against that, though, it is to me quite simply that guns do save lives of folks.
Listen, Howard Feldman, are you with us?
I am with you now. Thank you.
Hey, listen, I appreciate you calling in, folks. Howard Feldman is the Director of Regulatory and Scientific Affairs with the American Petroleum Institute. You're in Paris, as I understand it.
Yes.
Is it like 2:15 in the afternoon?
It is the afternoon. We keep going all morning, all day, all night, working on morning time, evening time, and East Coast time. So.
Now, you're from the East Coast, aren't you?
Yes.
Okay, I don't. Before we dive in, of course, Jim Riley is with us. Matt Wiedenhoeft is in station with us. Brian Thomas keeps us on path. I don't travel worldly like Jim Riley and you do. I don't know if I could get my body used to those big, gigantic time swings. For me, it's a big deal to go from Grand Haven to Muskegon. So, hey, listen, I've got a handful of questions while we've got you here. You're attending, as I understand it, the COP21 climate change conference. Is that
yes.
correct?
That is correct.
What's the general feel? And what I'm wondering when I ask that question is, how do you rate the productivity of the summit? And what I mean to say is that half or more of the country attendees have no interest in being honest about what they're going to be doing in terms of participants with whatever agreement comes out of this. So are you feeling a sense of excitement or gloom? What's the feeling there?
I think, we're early in the summit. The summit really kicked off on Monday, and the heads of state were here, and they gave their the type of heads of state, like President Obama gave his speech, talking about how everything can be solved and we all need to work together. So there's a lot of that going on. And now today, first, people are getting down and rolling up their sleeves and seeing if they can get language that they can agree on in what would be a very complicated agreement that there is not consensus on.
As I understand it now, well, first off, you've got a science and a political background. Is that accurate for me to say?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the reason I'm asking my next question, some of these I've got maybe a little bit technical, but as I understand it, part of the goal here is 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. First off, is that actually the goal? Do I understand that correctly? And then second off, in the big picture of life, as it were, is that going to move the needle at all? Does that make a difference?
So that is the goal that people are saying that they want to hope to achieve. Right now, the commitments that the various nations have indicated they'd be willing to make would not get you to that 2 degrees C based on the assuming all the models are correct, which is, of course, a big assumption. But it would not get you that far. So they still need more emissions reductions.
Howard, who came up with those numbers? When you say assuming those numbers are correct, my very next question, first off, I don't believe them and I don't know that they're achievable at all. That said, I'm wondering, where'd they come from?
So there's, if you do the modeling and, people project how much CO2 would be in the atmosphere and you run it through these sophisticated global climate models, tells you that if business as usual would get you a higher degree of climate change than that, and even with the reductions that people are projecting, that would still get you a 2.7 degree Celsius change.
Howard, here's my problem with the numbers, Howard. And I'm first off, I think anyone that listens to the show knows I'm not a scientific background kind of person. I'm a layman. That said, what I have done is followed this issue fairly closely for the last couple decades, coming forward from the coming ice age till now, I should say. And when I look at it, the bumps in the road for the global warmist people are the 10,000 plus emails that were found a few years ago and the 5,000 emails that were found in 2011, all of which exchanged ideas between scientists on how to muddy up these models to get them to depict global warming. And I think, God, it's hard for me to take these people serious, Howard.
Yeah, no, I understand where you are coming from, and
if someone,
I'm not in a position to defend the models.
No,
I assure you.
I'm not asking you to, but when I look at it and say we're sitting all of this on top of 16,000 lies that we can count, it's hard for me to say I'm really afraid of it.
Well, just a question, which we all know the answer to, but they're plugging data into the models and then showing the certain predictions going forward. How accurate have these models been in their predictive success over the last some number of years?
Yeah, so there was a big question about whether the models are able to. One way you test a model like that is you actually run it backwards. You say, can you predict the previous climates rather than the, then if you know what it is right now, could you back down and say what it was historically? And the models, I don't think were that successful at that. I think they've gotten better at that over time. But again, my job is not here to work on the models. I'm just trying to follow the different parts of the political dynamic here.
I get it, but when I'm looking, and please understand, I'm not trying to hang the models on your hook whatsoever. But when I look at them, I'm asking myself, can anyone say with certainty how much of impact swinging the solar panels and the renewable energy and all of these things that they're touting? What's the realistic likelihood that will actually move the needle if our goal is to move the needle in terms of temperature? Right. I'm not convinced I believe that, and so I'm looking not to put you in the corner of the models, but do you believe that human activity will move that global temperature even 1 degree C?
Yeah, well, we're dealing right now. It's really not a science question anymore. Right now we're dealing with a policy issue.
Right.
So the scientists have given one indication, and the politicians are moving in a different direction, and we all have to monitor how those policies are being made. And that's the challenge that we have right now, is just to make sure that anything that comes out of here is good public policy.
It feels like both sides are pretty shrill, my side and the uber left, but when I look at the facts, I mean everything that I can find by Googling, not looking at science, and certainly not at your level, Howard, but everything that I can find says that the global temperature has stabilized for the last 18, 19 years. They tell me all over the major news reporting agencies that the Antarctica at least is growing its size of ice. And I'm thinking, boy, if we're really trying to move 1 or 2 degrees, it looks like we're on that path without having a meeting filled with global tax and regulation, which, by the way, is what I believe is our actual goal.
Right. So that's something that we are trying to, as the American Petroleum Institute, our position is, to avoid additional regulation because we don't think it's necessary. Because the truth is, in the United States, we've brought down our emissions a lot already.
Right.
And a lot of that comes from increased use of natural gas in the U.S. And so that has actually lowered emissions dramatically to near 20-year lows from the U.S.
Oh,
so
Howard,
that's something.
I got a question for you. You're there with the G20, right?
Well, they call it COP21.
Okay.
So it's 150 nations here.
Out of all the 150 nations, what are we looking at that are actually in favor percentage-wise of going forward with cap and trade and all these other restrictions on your industry versus that aren't?
So the vast majority of nations here are in favor of binding targets that countries would have to meet.
Howard, let me stop you real briefly. On those nations that are interested in binding agreements, are we paying most of those nations out of U.S. taxpayer pockets? So are we saying here's $1 billion in aid? Will you vote with us?
Well, that's going to be one of the challenges is to see how much money moves around. That's going to be part of the agreements that come out of here.
Yeah, to me, it's always about follow the money, especially in this circumstance.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the big things that people will be asking for. Is there's some countries who are asking for, more and more money moving in their direction to help them, and we'll have to see how much money the payers are willing to pay. And, of course, as U.S. taxpayers, that some of that money will be coming out of our pockets.
Howard, I've got a question. You back to the politics of this. There have been any number of these confabs with proclamations about things that should be done, none of which were enforceable. But I heard something last night that President Obama was looking to come up with some type of an agreement that, in fact, would be binding on the United States, but would also avoid going and getting approval from Congress. What is that term, and is that what you think is going to be happening here?
So that what you heard is what came out of President Obama's remarks, and we are still trying to understand just what that is. Because obviously, if there's something that is binding like a treaty, that should have to go through Senate approval, and the Senate leadership has already indicated that they are not planning to approve such a treaty, and there are nations who say that they will not stop with an agreement that is not binding. So that's the challenge, and that's going to be the interesting dynamic to see where this ends up in 2 weeks when they try to deal with that issue.
Where is China and Russia on this?
They're sitting at the table. Russia has benefited from the modernization of its industry, and so their emissions are down. So they're sitting at the table, and China's emissions are, of course, sky high, and they're saying, yes, we will reduce our emissions as well. They've made those declarations in the interim that they are working towards lowering their emissions. Now, whether that will happen or not, and what their actual emissions are right now, is something that's open to debate.
Well, we've seen that before. When China will do something, the U.S. has to do it by 2020, and they'll do it by 2120.
Well, they're just simply never going to do it. My problem with the whole thing, other than all of the obviouses that we've talked about, is that President Obama is doing his best to not only. By the way, folks, when you sidestep the Senate, you're in effect sidestepping the citizens of the United States. He is purposely saying, we don't care about the 325 million people standing behind me or their elected officials. I'm going to do what I darn well please. I'm sitting here as a political hack, frankly, Howard, saying, how in the world can citizens stop what this man is doing?
Right, and the president feels like he has a mandate to do this, and it is something that most pundits think this is a legacy issue for him.
It is. We'll remember him for it.
And that it's going to be something really interesting. But our key points are that we are already in the U.S. lowering emissions through the use of our resources, and the government shouldn't do anything to interfere with the continuation of that, and should actually be touting it and expanding it, because that's what's gone on in the U.S. in the last 15 years, is that emissions now are declining.
Well, I took a class on sustainability, and a lot of these ISO 9000s and these companies that were going with the LEED certification found out that the high cost of transfer over was actually saving them in the long run millions of dollars to actually do this, what we're lowering emissions by. They actually found it was a cost savings in the long term. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so companies is very smart. They're looking for cost savings, but and that's something we believe that the U.S. is looking for cost savings. But as it turns out, a lot of the cost savings we can take actually do lower emissions. So it's a direction that we think should continue.
And they were doing that on their own in the free market rather than the federal government stepping in and telling them they had to.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Tell me this, Howard, from the folks that you're interacting with at the conference, is anyone defining how we're going to know when we won the war on climate change?
I think people will come away if there are binding targets. I think a lot of people will think that they have been very successful here. So I think that is the overall sense. Now, when what is the ideal climate? And you guys in Michigan will have to figure that out. Just what temperature you'd like it to be there.
What it is right now, no snow.
Somebody grab the thermostat. We need to mandate this. To me, I get a kick out of it because these folks can't predict what the weather's going to be like tomorrow with any certainty, and yet they're able to stand back and say, even though we know that weather is a perpetual state of change forever, we're going to somehow control it. To me, it's arrogance beyond belief is how I look at it.
Yeah.
Well, it's politics.
Okay, understood. Yeah.
Well, let me just add one more thing. It is politics. We're beyond the grand discussion here. Isn't about science and it isn't about models. It's about the ability of the United Nations group to basically force the United States into certain types of restrictions. What do you think the odds are? Again, a treaty apparently will not be binding on the United States. What type of political jib-jab would be possible that would force these policies on the United States that could get around Congress?
Yeah, that is the question. That's the question we're waiting to see. Now, understand, President Obama has already put significant regulations in place, both on power plants and on cars, the miles per gallon requirements, which have gone up significantly, and the power plant regulations, which they have put in place and will still undergo legal challenge. But they have moved forward with that already. So the administration is not waiting for a treaty or not treaty, whatever it is, to move forward on this. They also have, on my industry, we also have regulations that have been proposed to limit methane emissions from natural gas production and oil production, and so we think some of those are too onerous as well. So we're dealing with those, and those are also designed to address greenhouse gas emissions.
Hey, last couple of questions, Howard, before we run out of time, and I'll let you get back to enjoying the conference. But first is there a place that you can recommend our listeners go to find out more information about what's taking place there in Paris?
I do not know of one particular location, where they're doing a good job on it. I mean, I'm sorry about that.
No, I get it, because when I Google it, by the way, it's just an absolute rainbow of different. I find a different term. There's just an absolute across the spectrum of different websites that are talking about different things. It gets a little confusing to try to follow up on this.
Right. I mean, different industries have their own points of view. API has on the API.org website, spelled just like that, API.org. We have a climate section which talks through a lot of what the U.S. has done to move forward and what our industry has done in particular.
Very, very nice. Howard Feldman, Director of the Regulatory and Scientific Affairs with the American Petroleum Institute. What I'm hoping, Howard, is that I can get you back when you've got your feet back on U.S. soil to help us interpret what happened.
Okay, that sounds good.
Very, very good. Thank you very, very much for your time from Paris. Folks, we'll be right back, folks.
And back to the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. Into segment 2 with Mike Hewitt.
I can't get off the political stump on this one. To me, we've got almost 16,000 emails that we know exist. You can read them on the internet. What are these acclaimed scientists from around the world exchanging recipes on how to make the weather models predict global warming? I can't understand. I genuinely can't understand a reasonable mind looking at the evidence and saying, oh my goodness, the world's going to end. I just don't get it. Jim, what am I missing?
Well, I think that you're addressing two questions. Number one is, why do so many people in this country and in foreign countries, why do they support the whole concept of CO2-based global warming caused by man? And that is primarily because they're not getting the entire story. You have followed it. Everyone in this studio understands that the entire concept behind the CO2 causing global warming is a fraud. Number one, there has not been any discernible warming as judged by any number of models, and not just models, by actual global temperatures for the last 20 years or so, which is absolutely flies in the face of what the models had predicted. At the same time, we do know that carbon dioxide has gone up, but here's the real key. Carbon dioxide has gone up and down in the air in the world for millions upon millions of years.
For the length of the history of the world.
And the key here is the only correlation between carbon dioxide increase in the air and temperatures was about a 40-year time frame. If you just look at that one little time frame, it looks, oh my golly, look, carbon dioxide up, temperatures up, this is a cause. That's correlation, not causation.
But it wasn't as high as it was when Thomas Jefferson
was in
Paris helping to write the Constitution.
So when you go back and look at the hockey, the hockey stick, which shows this tremendous increase in world temperatures and correlating with world atmospheric increase in CO2, it looks attractive, but the reality is when you go back and you see the real numbers, it's a flawed fraud. And the question then would be, why would all these thousands upon thousands of academics and scientists and others be on board? Because they all get paid. Think about this. If you are a college professor and you want to get funding, and your letter to the federal government to get funding for your next year's studies is, I think things are just fine. You're not going to get any money. You have to say, look, things are awful, and I have to research into it. That's how you get the funding. So is there a greed motive behind this? You bet there is.
It's about
all money.
It's about, well, there's another factor. It is about two issues. Money is certainly serving as the grease that caused the skid to slide. But I got to tell you, and this is where people are going to roll their eyes or driving on the road going, oh, Mike's going off the edge. To me, this is about the only single word that they've said that was true in the entire global weather issue going back to the coming ice age in the mid-'70s is the word globalization. That is the only word that's come out of their mouth that was the truth, and that is their agenda.
Explain what you mean by globalization.
Are they going to pay to make it happen with taxpayer money? You betcha. Are they heading towards a global government? You betcha.
Who is the they?
Who is they? They, in this case, is President Obama.
Well, I think it's more than that. It's the United Nations. It is the United Nations.
They, in this case, are small countries that would love to have the United States distribute its wealth around the globe. So if you're a little poor country and you're somewhere a former bloc or you're in some island somewhere, and you're thinking, jeepers, we don't have near the economy or standard of living as the United States. So we love the idea of globalization. Give us some more climate change, please. I've got to tell you, I genuinely believe that the long-term goal of all of this is globalization in terms of government control.
Well,
absolutely believe it. Listen, our own government controls what we do with federal money. So if you look at it from that standpoint, we want Egypt to do something different. We give them federal money. We want Michigan to do something different. We give them federal money. We want a town in Egypt to do something, so we give them money, and we want a town in Michigan to do something. We're going to call it a grant and give them federal money. Yes, money serves as the grease that causes the skids to slide, but you got to say, where is this track taking us?
Well, let's get clear here. It doesn't always, because we are the prime funder of the United Nations. We give them enormous amounts of money, and they don't do anything we want them to do.
They're doing what we want them to do right now. They're letting that man stand up there and babble for 45 minutes and tell nothing but lies.
Well, that's true. As a matter of fact, he is buying lots of friends there. Here's the key here. When you mention the term they is the people in the United Nations. It might be the heads of state, but primarily it's the bureaucracy.
They is anybody who's going to benefit from global wealth distribution. Well, that's who they is.
But the mechanism that will take the money from the United States via call it cap and trade or whatever penalties, because that's the whole reason for this meeting. They want to be able to get the United States, they want to force the United States to give money to some entity. Now, that entity will be the United Nations.
Well,
they will then distribute the money.
You say they want us.
United Nations,
You say
yes.
the United Nations want to force the United States. The problem I have with that statement, Jim, is that Obama is the president of the United States, and he's the one forcing the issue. He's the guy that
he's in cahoots.
He's the guy behind the curtain pulling the levers.
Absolutely.
He's doing it, not some evil UN from some country I've never heard of or can't pronounce. It is President Obama. It is our government. Listen, we'll watch Congress and see what they do. Will Congress allow the EPA to strip our economy? Will they?
I think that's a good question, and I think maybe you ought to go into that in a little greater detail because I think that's an important point. Can a rogue president get together with an America-hating body and do things that the rest of us, the citizens in the country, seem to be against?
The EPA is part of the executive branch of this government.
Which means what? Can he get away with anything he wants?
That means, well, evidently, because the only way to stop the EPA in that branch of government is to defund it. And that won't happen in this Congress because there isn't the will to say no.
And there's over a year before we get a new president.
And by the way, there is a majority that agree with you and I on this, the three of us. The problem with that is that majority isn't a majority enough to override a veto. So they sit around and go, what do we do? Do we play games with this guy? Do we just go, oh, shucks, you won this one? What do we do when we know that we cannot override a veto? Listen, folks, we've got to stop it for a minute. We ran way over in the first segment, so we're a little bit out of time. We're going to go to a break. We'll come back. We'll finish this and do an extremely abbreviated Enigma report. Folks, we'll be right back.
And now back to the Mike Hewitt Show, brought to you by RenegadeRiver.com. And we have arrived to the part of the show that may freak you out. It may make you wonder, why did I stay this long? But whatever the case is, you're here now, and so is Mike. It is the Enigma Report.
Listen, I'm really torn because the horse that we've been riding for the first two segments is something I think is really, really important.
A little emotion going there.
Listen, I got to tell you, I think this is critical. When I look at who's there to help us defend ourselves, I see a lot of folks. And listen, most of them are good folks. When you get elected into the House, into the Senate, whether it's state or whether it's federal, and you get set down with the House or the Senate majority or the House caucus, and they say, listen here, come here, you don't understand. We're going to explain it to you, and there's some financial contributions for your campaign involved. We're going to explain it to you. We're going to tell you the things that the common person doesn't know, and that will help you see things differently. And all of a sudden I'm going, what happened to the conservative that I went door to door for? Where did that person go? Here's what I'm saying. I'm not ragging on any particular party. I'm not ragging on any particular elected official. I'm saying when I look at topics like global warming, like taxation in general, like the Second Amendment, or the First Amendment, by the way, which has been pared down to almost meaningless, other than they wish they had a big enough cane to get me off this radio, and a lot of other folks like us. When I look at that, and I think there's EPA out of control, and no one's going to put it away. No one's going to arrest that monster. And I'm thinking, where are the people if their agenda is their own financial contributions, if their own agenda is to watch hockey instead of paying attention to the details, who in the heck is defending us? I keep hearing from the uber left, what about the middle class? The middle class and the lower class and the upper class, folks, we are all in trouble unless we pay attention. That's what I'm saying to you. Now, let me segue on to the Enigma report, and I'll get off that dog for one just for today, because I bet we revisit it next week. If a person went from fresh out of school, high school, graduated with honors, got very good grades, and said, when I grow up, I want to be whatever, something that requires a master's degree. And by the way, folks, almost everything requires a master's degree because they've watered down the degree so much that a 4-year degree means not so much. It means what you remember hearing about your great-great-grandfather that graduated from the 8th grade. That's what it means. Only difference is that he didn't pay $100,000 for it. Okay, so here's the way the Brave New World. And which book was that from, Jim? The Brave New World.
Aldous Huxley.
It's a scary thing. Listen, the government now, since the government has almost completely taken over federal school tuition loans, You can borrow $25,000 a year is the last I saw the mark of it. So if you want to get a master's degree so that you can actually earn $30,000 a year, wait a minute. Was that really my goal? I want to get a master's so I can get 30. If I really, really hump for a long time, I can get my income up to 50, but I'll owe $150,000 to $170,000. And I went, what? Does that make sense to somebody? So I've got Matt Wiedenhoeft. You know a little bit about higher education. You've got a master's degree.
Yeah.
Was it free?
No.
Not so much?
$135,000 is the max out for loans.
Okay.
I'm at that.
Okay. Good for you. Wise
Right.
decision.
Right now, I owe $172,000.
Here's the
How's
problem.
that possible? And I haven't made a payment yet.
Listen,
Somehow
now you are a teacher, and I want to get into what school you teach for. I want to get into all that. But you tell me, because you do teach higher education now, when I look at our education, first off, I challenge the curriculum. I challenge anyone willing to come sit in the studio with me during my hour. I challenge the curriculum. I think it's nonsense. Having said that, I do believe in continued education. And I'm saying, where's the trade schools? How come I've always said 1,000% increase in education. Huffington Post. How often does Mike Hewitt quote Huffington Post? Huffington Post wrote an article that said in the last 3 decades has risen 1,140%. What? And this is the same as what I was talking about before, Jim Riley. Why isn't the American people up in arms saying enough? We're not going to do this.
Money's tied to it. There's the
But
Pell Grant.
it is money. And you know what? The elected officials that we've elected that are supposed to say no have bought in because money's tied to it.
Oh, yeah.
And the citizens are the ones that have been absolutely convinced that air will stop flowing through their lungs if they don't get a degree. It's a big, gigantic money pot that's being stolen. We're taking young people. We're stealing their future with this massive debt that's greater than the mortgage I started with my house.
Let me just take away from what you just said, which is 100% correct. But when my generation, the baby boomers, and many of the subsequent generations graduated from high school or college, the first thing that they worked for, once they got themselves, an apartment and maybe some furniture, was they started saving up for a home. And fairly quickly after high school graduation or college graduation, they were able to get a mortgage. They would go borrow, let's just say in today's dollars, $100,000, and they would go buy a home. So they would have a $100,000 debt, and they'd have a home. Now, when you own a home, one of the reasons the governments promote home ownership, you do lots of cool stuff. You buy appliances, you buy carpets, you do all sorts of things. You stimulate the economy. Home ownership is one of the best things that you can do for an economy. Now, fast forward to today. Now we have those same young people, be they high school, but in particular college, because the kids, so many more are going to college, and of course, so not that many more are actually graduating from college. But now the children, who are now young adults in their early to mid-20s, they're saying, okay, I'm out of college, I've got that $100,000 debt, but I don't have a house. So I'm not adding to the economy. As a matter of fact, I don't even owe that debt to a bank that might pay taxes on its profit. I own the $100,000 debt to the federal government. There's not only do we just perhaps destroyed many, many young lives who'll be paying for who knows how long. There's absolutely not one benefit to the society, to the economy because of this, and yet they have the same debt. It's a terrible, terrible move.
I think
people are starting to learn.
Listen, Jim, I think there are two things that America better wake up and pay attention to. The first is that I said this last week in the Enigma report. The first is I genuinely believe that the uber left are working towards turning your bachelor's degree into part of your K through 12, making it K through 16. That's part one. Part two is if you think the housing bubble was a problem, wait till this education bubble bursts with the debt that's owed to the federal government, and the federal government tries to figure a way to get out of it, and they will. They're going to dispel it, and you're going to collect it out of your incomes. So there's the fellow that's been working for 35 years in his trade, and suddenly his taxes are going to go up because he's going to pay for this big, gigantic tuition that nobody can pay for.
It's even worse than that. Let me just throw one thing in here. This is to me great. In the United States, you make a decision. Should I put myself at risk to go take significant loans in order to get a college degree? Now, many people say, you know what, I just can't afford that. For any number of reasons, I just can't afford that. So if this country is going to move to the direction that, Mike, you suggest, which I agree with, the government, the politicians, certainly Hillary Clinton and others have said, we're going to forgive all these loans. So think about this. We will be in a country that is said to those who have the college degrees, we're going to forgive your debt, and we're going to make the people who made the decision not to take the debt, who don't have the college degrees, we're going to make them pick up the tab. Is this a great country or what? It's wrong. You would think that the little people would rise up and say there's something wrong with me paying the loans of a college educated person, but that's where we are going.
Well, back to what you said, Jim. I'm living this. I have this debt. I've talked to my brother who's a mortgage underwriter and everything. I couldn't buy a house right now because my debt to income is so high based on my loan amount.
Sure.
$173,000. My payment, I have to make over $36,000 a year minimum just to do it.
With your master's degree.
Yeah,
Good
just
for
to
you.
pay the payment.
Good for you. Am I jealous? Well,
it's the reality, and having the government to step in to pay that bill and put it on the backs of younger people is frankly, I think, a disgrace.
Yeah, and by the way, the interest rate when I first started was under 4%. The government took it over. It's now over 6.5%.
And the reason for that is so many defaults.
wait a minute. What's the bank rate? If you did, what's a mortgage rate right now? Jim, you follow this stuff. If I wanted to go buy a home right now,
I believe you can get a mortgage right now for around 4%. But the difference is this: in a mortgage, if you don't pay, the bank gets the house.
Right.
In a student loan, if you don't pay, the bank gets stiffed.
I'll give them the degree.
Well, they don't want it. They want their money.
Well, I got to tell you. So the government is trying to say we're helping you for only an extra 2.5%, right? Is that what we're saying?
That's apparently they're trying to get credit for their good-naturedness. Yeah.
It goes back to what I was talking about last week in the Enigma report, where you've got all of our state colleges and here in the state of Michigan, where our Constitution well beyond the tuition we're talking about, where our state Constitution demands that our state government give these college level universities money, but does not provide for our legislature or the people to actually have any direct control. And I think, what kind of system is, here's some money, but I can't tell you or even ask you what you're going to do with it. And let me tell you what they've done with it. They've got big, gigantic busloads of vice presidents that are making $250,000 up to $1 million a year. And I think, what? That's what they're doing with our tax money? That's what they're doing with your money after you've studied your butt off to actually get a future? They're taking it or giving it to somebody that works part-time for $250,000 a year? That, to me, folks, says the American people need to dial up and start paying attention.
They are not paying the person in the classroom that's actually giving the lecture and the information to help these students anywhere near that. So you're overinflating the administrative costs, not the instructor costs. I can tell you that much. Where this information for college is actually given to the student, which is the important part, people providing the service are not getting what you're talking. That's all administrative costs, is what you're telling us, right?
It's just gobbled up. The teachers
it's the total cost.
Yeah.
I mean,
most of the teachers,
over different parts.
A lot of the teacher base have become adjunct professors, so they're not getting benefits. They're not getting full-time wages. It's a changing world. Listen, folks, we're going to have another big show next week. If you want to follow what it's going to be, find us on Facebook / The Mike Hewitt Show. Follow us at Twitter. And Twitter, it's Talk Mike Hewitt. Beyond that, we'll see you next week, or we'll see you on Facebook in the meantime. And if you've got questions, I have a way to get a hold of our guest today. If you've got questions you wished I would have asked about him, don't be shy. Ask me on Facebook. I'll get a hold of the guy and I'll post the questions on Facebook. Beyond that, get involved. Contact your legislature. Tell them you've had enough. And don't drive Uber. They won't let you carry your firearm. See, Jim, I'm not going to support that. Not even in the very end. I'm saying, I'm out.
I respect your challenge.
I'm out. Folks, listen, you got to find me on Facebook because that's where all the fun happens between the shows. Beyond that, we'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m.